Now, you started digging into this story at The Guardian 2 years ago, really digging into it. The police said there was nothing else to it. Murdoch's people said there was nothing else to it. Did you have any doubts at any point that this wouldn't really lead anywhere?
There was a moment in around the end of 2009 when nobody was biting. The police had really put the story to bed by coming out and denying it all. News International denied it. They said we were deliberately misleading the British public. The regulator, we have these quaint things called regulators, press regulators in Britain. They said there was nothing in it. And no other papers were following it up. So round about the end of 2009, early 2010, it was looking as though it was only us. But Nick Davis, our reporter, was very determined, and I knew he was never going to give up.
On that point, your deputy editor, Ian Katz, was quoted the other day as saying that you were, and the paper were, slightly obsessive about this story. How do you plead?
Well, I think you have to be, especially a story in which you don't get a sort of clean win to begin with. So I think the lesson of this story all round is if everybody had come out and paid attention to the story that we wrote exactly 2 years ago in July 2009, the News of the World would still be alive, and I think Rebecca Brooks would probably still be in a job. And we wouldn't have this giant crisis. Why
do you think, Alan, that with a few exceptions, almost nobody in the British media did aggressively follow up your story? Were some of these organizations perhaps afraid that their own techniques might be looked at?
Well, that's what people say. I don't know. I mean, there was a moment when just before the British election, there was an employment tribunal which found that Andy Coulson had presided over a culture of bullying at the News of the World. And a former reporter was awarded $1 million in damages. I mean, that's just a staggering finding against a man who's just about to walk into number 10 Downing Street, and not a single paper reported it. And I just can't understand why there was a kind of sort of omerta in which nobody wanted at that point to take on anything to do with News International.
Well, that sounds almost like a blackout, and it makes me wonder whether there was not just concern, but fear among some in the British media establishment, not to mention the political establishment, that taking on the Murdoch empire could have troubling consequences.
Well, I think that's exactly the story. I think this is why it's such a grave story, such a serious story about British public life. Because what you've seen in the last 2 weeks is the Prime Minister effectively saying that. He was effectively saying, we felt we needed Murdoch in order to get or keep in power. There's the extraordinary behavior by the police, who it was revealed yesterday, unknown to anybody, had hired the former deputy editor of the News of the World as an advisor to the police commissioner. I mean, just extraordinary. And then you had the regulator who behaved in the same way. So I think the story for the last, generation in Britain has been this has been a rather frightening organisation to mess with, and it was best not to.
It all seems so incestuous in terms of people from Murdoch's company later being hired by others. You mentioned the police, and of course Andy Coulson, the former editor of News of the World, being hired as the top communications advisor to David Cameron. You had a conversation with the incoming Prime Minister about that. Can you recount that for us?
Well, we tried to warn all the party leaders of something that we couldn't write in February 2010. So this, again, you have to understand the quaint British laws that we have, that you can't write about people who are charged with things and waiting for the trial. And we knew there was a private investigator, another private investigator, who was charged with an axe murder. And he had been in prison earlier for planting cocaine on someone, so he was a really bad man, and he'd been hired by Andy Coulson's News of the World straight from prison in 2005. So that was a story we couldn't write. But I thought the Prime Minister, or the future Prime Minister, should know that, and I thought Nick Clegg and Gordon Brown should know that. So I got a message to Cameron's office via my deputy to that effect, and we now know that it got to his Chief of Staff, but his Chief of Staff didn't think that was worth passing on.
But did that put you in the position, perhaps the uncomfortable position, of offering advice to David Cameron and other politicians about who they should or should not hire?
It wasn't advice. I mean, he was free to do what he wanted, and I went to see Gordon Brown and emailed Nick Clegg. So I was doing it equally with all the parties. I just thought particularly as this was a story that was being ignored, I thought people ought to know that there was going to be a story at some point that everybody would be writing, and haven't we seen that this week? Just because we couldn't write it and blow it open then didn't mean that there wasn't serious mud coming down the slipway.
You caused a huge stir at The Guardian when you reported roughly a week ago that former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, that his family medical records had been accessed by The Sun, another Murdoch tabloid, and that was, of course, led to the story that the 5-month-old baby at that time had cystic fibrosis, created a huge international uproar. Brown was outraged. On Friday, The Guardian apologized and said that you retracted that story and said that you did not have evidence that the medical records were, in fact, obtained by The Sun. That's a pretty bad mistake, isn't it?
Well, the difference is between the medical information and the medical records. So the Sun say that they didn't have access to the medical records, and Gordon Brown, his recollection, as he told us, was that they did say that they had the medical records. But if the Sun, so that's the difference. But I don't think if you spoke to Gordon Brown tonight, he wouldn't say that he was happy about the Sun ringing him up and saying that they were going to publish information about his medical condition. So I don't think it makes it much better for the Sun. But The Guardian, unlike the News International titles, corrects things or clarifies things when we get things wrong.
So there's a difference between making that kind of mistake, which you did, of course, correct, and all the allegations that have swirled around News of the World. You don't see them as in any way comparable.
Well, we haven't used illegal techniques. We haven't been going around on an industrial scale hacking into people's phones. And we haven't denied for 2 years, as News International did, that there was anything wrong. Within 2 days, The Sun said that's not quite right, and we corrected it.
Were there whispers, or perhaps more than whispers, during this time when you were sort of out there on a limb, somewhat lonely, continuing to write stories about this matter, the rest of the British media establishment not following you, that you were doing this for competitive reasons, that this was some kind of anti-Murdoch campaign?
Oh, yeah, of course people said that. They said that we were, a left-wing title, that we hated Murdoch, that we were doing it because we were a competition with the Times. They've said all these things. And my answer to that is if you stopped trying to think about our motives and just read the stories, you'd be in a better place today.
Do you now feel vindicated, or is there also some collateral damage here? I mean, it was News of the World, perhaps it was The Sun, for all of British journalism, perhaps all of journalism, in that it's a further undermining of public confidence in what we do?
Well, what was going on at the News of the World was terrible, and I don't think any decent journalist in the world would defend that kind of journalism. No one came into journalism to do that kind of thing. But it's not a neutral act, what you're doing, if you are doing these stories that no one else can get because you're using these vile techniques. Then, no wonder the News of the World and The Sun, but particularly the News of the World, was the biggest selling title on a Sunday. So that has commercial consequences for everyone else. And I think that's why everyone was so alarmed that this organization was getting so big and was about to almost double its size. You forget that Rupert Murdoch owned 40% of the press, with a lot of cross-subsidizing of titles through the profits of one to another. So I think it was a black period in journalism, and I think it's utterly to the good that that's been cleaned up. Although, of course, we must make sure that they don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and now try and put restrictions on the press, on decent journalists, which is 95% of journalists in this country. Right.
Putting shackles on journalists would not be, in my view, a good response to this incredible and incredibly disturbing story.
I'm with you on that.
Alan Rusbridger, thanks very much for joining us.